Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Very cool. Well, I'd like to show you something, if I may. In our gospel reading this morning, we heard about a widow who gave 2 small coins. These are them. This is an actual, what would be called a lepton, that the widow would have given in that time period in Jerusalem to the treasury. Very small in comparison with perhaps a regular coin. Okay? So this was the coin that this widow came and gave. 2 of them. It was the smallest denomination of the day. Marilyn, you can vouch for it because you were there in Israel, so you can. I know you can barely see them, but that's kind of the point. Okay, there's not much to them, and certainly afterwards, if you would like, you're welcome to take a look at it. There's not really a lot. There's barely really much of a design on it at all. Very crude, not really a lot of artistic detail at all. Very simple. And anybody who would have been giving an offering to the temple there in Jerusalem in Jesus' day would have gone to one of 13 different large boxes, if you will, that would have been scattered around one of the outer courtyards. And she would have gone, and others would have gone, to put their offering into these boxes. Now, what's very interesting about these wooden boxes is that on top of the wooden boxes, there was like a metal funnel, bronze actually, okay? And so there was this funnel that would kind of collect the coin that would have been tossed into it, and it would have kind of just funneled it down into the box itself. And every one of these 13 boxes scattered throughout the large courtyard would have had that, okay? So when you would have put the coin, if you will, into the offering, you would have kind of heard kind of like a little clank. Okay? All right, you hear that? All right. Now here's the widow's mite.
Oh dear.
Not much, really. Okay? Listen again. Here's like a regular one. The widow's mite. Okay? Very small. Really not much of anything. And you really only really heard it because you were listening for it. Okay? Obviously in a courtyard of people with a lot of hustle and bustle, you would have not even known anything of it, right? And it was very common for when people came to make their offerings, if you will, to kind of make a show of it. Oh, I'm a great giver. Lots of coins would have signified a larger offering. Few coins, or very small coins, would have signified a small offering. Jesus sees this widow offering 2 of the smallest, really the smallest coins of the least value to the temple treasury, and says something pretty amazing, that she, in her offering, gave more than those who gave more coins of even greater value. Why? Firstly, Jesus is talking about proportion. Notice again the words that specifically Jesus says in verse 44 of Mark chapter 12. He says, "Those who gave a lot gave out of their wealth, but this widow gave out of her poverty." So he's not simply comparing a large amount with a small amount. Simple math would say, of course, this is greater than this. But he's talking about proportion. What these people gave was a large proportion. And really, I should say it was a small proportion compared to what they already had. Okay? So for them, giving a lot, really, it's not like they missed it. Okay? Whereas even though the widow gave a smaller amount, proportionately, it was greater to her wealth. And that is what he is holding up here. he is holding up proportionate giving, not just simple, how much do you give, okay? When I was a kid playing Monopoly with my best friend, I remember on one particular time, he was doing really well, and obviously I wasn't. He had landed on free parking, he had key properties to collect the rent from me, he had 3 railroads, he had Indiana Avenue with a house on it, and yes, he even had a boardwalk. Okay? You guys played Monopoly, right? Yeah, okay. All right. Even if I landed on one of his cheaper properties, like St. James Place, with a rent of only $14, okay, it still cost me significantly more of my money, because that's all that I had. So $14 was kind of a big deal, okay? Whereas him, if he landed on one of my more expensive properties, like, Marvin Gardens, that had a whopping rent of $24, okay, he easily paid it. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, but for whatever reason, I remember in my head, I remember that he would say this phrase, chump change, kind of a thing, It's like, no big deal. Here's $24 for you, not a big deal, Yeah. I mean, yes, he paid more money, but proportionately to what he had, it was nothing. Okay? So again, the point of Jesus is highlighting the widow's giving is not the amount specifically, it is the proportion. And so many people sometimes read this passage, and what they take away from it is, see, it doesn't matter what I give to God, I just need to give something. And that's not at all what Jesus is saying. What he's saying is, you need to still give extravagantly, proportionately to your income. The widow did, and it was commended. The others didn't, and it really didn't mean as much. So the first point of this whole story of the widow's giving is proportion. Give proportion. The second point is purpose. One of the reasons why Jesus highlights this widow's example of giving is her purpose. Remember again, those boxes that had the bronze funnels on top, okay? You know what they were actually called? Trumpets. When many gave, their coins hit the bronze funnels with obviously a lot of clink, right? So we have a lot of noise. Okay? And of course, like we talked about before, the weightier coins, the bigger coins with greater value, would have made a bigger sound as compared to the actual coin that the widow gave, which was very small, which made hardly any noise. Just before Jesus points out the widow, we cannot forget what he says earlier. He says, beware of the scribes, beware of the teachers of the law who toot their own horn and make a show of their religiosity. And he talks about how they like to walk around in, long rows, okay? And they like to make a big show of their religiosity and say really big, long prayers to kind of make them look good, okay? And he says, beware of them, because they're doing all of this not just for show, but they're doing it in a way that actually is unfair and unjust. By devouring, he actually says, widows' homes. So we can't look at the extravagant giving part of the widow without also looking at the injustices and the abuses of power that were being done by the religious people at that time. And honestly, still happen today. Jesus is saying what they're doing is for pomp and circumstance. They're abusing their religious obligation to take advantage of the poor and the vulnerable, like widows, and here's one of them. So that's why that story kind of flows in from what he's talking about earlier. They gave, oftentimes, to flaunt themselves, to show themselves with power and prestige, and it was like blowing their own trumpet, tooting their own horn. They gave for themselves and not for God. And when you understand that that was actually called, that bronze funnel on top was actually called a trumpet, now listen to Jesus' words in Matthew 6. When you give, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that you may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you give, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Isn't that fascinating? Doesn't that make that scripture come all the more alive? Okay? He's saying, don't toot your own horn in your giving. Don't blow your own trumpet by making a show of your giving, by having all these coins fall in and making all this loud noise and everything. Ooh, I'm giving to God. The widow obviously is not blowing her own horn. Her 2 small coins barely made a sound, right? She is not heralding herself. Her giving is just between her and God. Yes, give. Yes, be generous. But do it for God's honor, not your own. So we've seen in this story already how Jesus commends the widow for her proportionate giving and for her godly, purposeful giving. Another reason that he holds up the widow as this example before others isn't just about proportion, isn't just simply about purpose. It's also about what her giving produces. What comes, if you will, of her giving? In a word, discipleship. Repeatedly in the Gospels, over and over and over again, we see people who seem unlikely examples of faith, unlikely examples of obedience, unlikely examples of character, who do exactly that. They show forth faith. They show forth obedience. They show forth their character by loving God and loving others. And it's almost always the people that you would least expect it to be. Often, the examples that we see in the Gospels are of people who, like I said, were outcasts. Perhaps their rights were very few. They were people of little prestige. They were religious. And Jesus frequently holds the others up as being, these are the ones to follow. The marginalized, the weak, the poor, the second class, all of those that generally society cared less about. And he says, look at their example and how they're conducting themselves. That's discipleship. These others, not so much. And so it's kind of interesting that he holds up the widow as a disciple before his disciples. A widow in Jewish culture would have not had much to lean on. No dependable income, no spiritual covering, no job, no rights, no voice. And yet it is this widow who not only exercises faith in giving her offering to God, she exercises sacrifice and denial of self in her devotion to him. She embodies Jesus' very words from Mark chapter 8, verse 34. If anyone be my disciple, they must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Instead of holding tightly to the little she had, trusting on it to somehow help her, she gives it over to God, and she leans on him to help her. We can say we trust God all we want, but in our culture, just as in the culture then, let's be honest, money is one of the greatest gods than anything else. We follow it more than we follow God. We let it decide our course of action more than him. And so Jesus uses the widow, of all the people, to highlight discipleship. Her giving is not in guilt. It's not to earn God's favor, nor is it in religiosity, to just simply check a box off to say, see, I'm a good person. She's not giving to manipulate God, to make God bless her. She just simply gives out of devotion, faith, and obedience to honor God. It's pure. And that's why he holds her up as the example of discipleship, rather than so many others. Giving proportionately, giving for godly purposes, and discipleship as a product of giving. There's a quote that says, "Stare at Jesus long enough and you'll be a giver. Give long enough and you'll become like Jesus." I mean, think about it. Being made in the image of God means that we are to reflect his character. And certainly he's loving, certainly he's creative, but he's also generous. He gives. And so we, as followers of Christ and made in God's image, are to be givers. Not sparingly, but generously. It's part of living into our image as God's children. Stare at Jesus long enough, and you'll be a giver. Give long enough, and you'll become like Jesus. At the end of our service today, we will receive a pledge card to take home and to pray about our financial giving for 2019, our giving to this congregation. Practically, yes, it helps us with a budget, certainly. But spiritually, your pledge is an exercise of faith. It's an exercise of trusting God. It's also a sign of saying, I'm going to partner with you, God, in what you want to do through the church, which is us. It's saying, God, how do you want me to partner and give with what you are doing through us, through me, with us, with others? It's a sign of faith. Your giving will help us together to be the hands and feet of Christ in 2019. Whether it's proclaiming salvation, hospitality, worship, service, outreach, healing prayer, caring for one another, showing mercy, or teaching biblical truth, your giving is an outward sign of the inward grace God has given you. As you pray about your financial giving for 2019, as we learn from the example of the widow in the Gospel of Mark, ask God, please, to help you to give generously in proportion with your income. May you give for godly purposes, to honor him. And may you do so just because you're a disciple who wants acts of generosity to produce other disciples. In this day and age where everybody wants to argue about beliefs, where everybody wants to argue about who's right and who's wrong, certainly you can debate until the cows come home in regards to what a belief is, or what's right or what's wrong. Do you know what you can't argue with? Generous acts of love. People can't deny that. Generosity is an expression of love. And generous believers touch the hearts of others to believe and follow a generous God too.